Well, I'm very pleased indeed to be back at Christchurch. I'd like to thank Professor Bigger for inviting me to give this lecture. The chance to put some ideas together on this subject came at a very opportune time. I've been asked to speak on the subject of Britain and the First World War. Was it all worth it? Well, the centenary commemorations of the First World War are, of course, over. I was privileged to be in Westminster Abbey on the 11th of November for the national commemoration of the armistice. But of course, the dust is really only now beginning to settle. And in planning this lecture on whether the First World War was, from a specifically British perspective, worthwhile, I was constantly being struck by the divergence of views about this crucial topic between what has been said over the last 4.5 years and those views which were generally held a century ago. So this lecture has morphed somewhat into really a comparison between how Britain's war was regarded when it was actually going on, and indeed shortly after, and how it is regarded today. Well, let's start at the place that in 2014 became almost synonymous with the commemoration of the outbreak of the First World War, that is, the Tower of London. Quoting from the Tower of London Remembers website, the major art installation, Blood-Swept Lands and Seas of Red at the Tower of London opened on the 5th of August 2014, which marked 100 days since the first full day of Britain's involvement in the First World War. Created by artists Paul Cummins and Tom Piper, 888,246 ceramic poppies were used in the installation. Each poppy represented a British military fatality during the war. The poppies encircled the iconic landmark, i.e. the Tower of London, creating not only a spectacular display visible from around the tower, but also a location for personal reflection. The scale of the installation was intended to reflect the magnitude of such an important centenary and create a powerful visual commemoration. And it goes on to say how every day at sunset, the names of 180 British and Empire soldiers were read out as part of a roll of honour. Well, the most striking aspect, I think, was the weeping willow. The weeping window of poppies cascading down the wall of the tower and into the moat. And this installation was dismantled on the 11th of November 2014, despite calls for it to remain. As one critic said at the time, its transience was part of its power. Now, the tower poppies undoubtedly captured the public's imagination. Many clearly were deeply moved, and an estimated 5 million people visited the installation during the 4 months it was on display. And then the weeping window and the wave, which was a metal poppy-covered structure, went on tour around the UK, where again it proved highly popular. There's little doubt, I think, that the Blood-Swept Lands and Seas of Red will be remembered as the British cultural commemoration of the outbreak of the First World War. As indicated by its title, this installation was all about death. Concentration on the scale of the fatalities is the defining characteristic of the modern British popular view of the First World War. And this is not surprising, as the losses were the largest in British history, dwarfing those of the Second World War, which were not small. And in some ways, this concentration on those who died is an admirable, liberal and humanitarian response. But it is, I think, in sharp contrast to our views of the Second World War, which is more often than not seen as a necessary war, fought against tyranny, against an evil enemy which posed a direct threat to Britain. This is very different from the views on the First World War, where frankly there's rarely any serious consideration of the political objectives that the UK was pursuing in that conflict, in the popular sphere. The gravity of the crisis faced by the British state and empire in 1914 to 18 tends to be either ignored or downplayed, often with 20/20 hindsight being deployed to argue that the Kaiser's Germany wasn't as bad as Hitler's Germany, which is true, but doesn't get you very far. To borrow the pattern of just war theory, the ends for which the war were fought are regarded as not being worth the human misery involved, and the means by which victory was achieved, assuming that people do realise that Britain and its allies were actually victorious, are reviled. Significantly, the bloody attrition of the Somme and Passchendaele are remembered, but the victorious 100 Days of 1918 are generally not. Well, I went to see the Tower Poppies on their very last day, on the 11th of November 2014, and it was indeed an impressive artwork. But as a historian of the First World War, what struck me was the lack of context. The installation could have been commemorating a natural disaster. I looked and failed to find anything around the display which explained why such large numbers of men died. Of course, because the poppy as a symbol is embedded deep in the British national psyche, everybody knew what the poppies meant. It was all about the lives that were lost. Research by Jenny Kidd and Joanne Sainer has shown that such tropes as men as having died for freedom were expressed by a number of visitors to the poppies, but in a rather vague way. Conversely, a volunteer who helped prepare the installation recorded that the futility of the war is rammed home with every poppy hammered into the ground. What good did their deaths do was asked again and again as we planted. What have we learned from it was another. Jonathan Jones, the art critic of The Guardian, denounced the Tower Poppies as a prettified and toothless war memorial. What a lie. The First World War was not noble. War is not noble. A meaningful mass memorial to this horror would not be dignified or pretty. The moat of the tower should be filled with barbed wire and bones. That would mean something. Now, Jones', I'll say very controversial view, is a version of the widespread notion that the First World War was futile. But both this view and actually the vague died for freedom view show very little understanding of why 888,246 died. Well, this lengthy preamble is by way of arguing that the answer to the exam question I've been set to remind ourselves it is Britain of the First World War, was it all worth it, is by no means straightforward. For a start, we need to differentiate between views held in 2019 from those held while the war was going on. We need to decide what it means to be worth it, and even exactly what we understand the First World War to mean. Because to complicate matters further, the First World War was not a single unitary conflict, and it's perfectly possible to differentiate between different aspects in terms of whether or not the fighting was worth it. By this, I'm taking as a simple cost-benefit analysis. In my view, the war against Germany and the parallel war against the Ottoman Empire deserve to be treated differently, and I'll come back to that later on. The figure which I've given, 888,246 Tower Poppies commemorating the dead, in fact requires some explanation. This is not the usual figure given for First World War fatalities. The round figure is normally 1 million British Empire casualties, of which roughly 3/4 came from the British Isles. But nonetheless, this figure is perfectly valid, it being the number who died between the 4th of August 1914 and the 31st of August 1921. That latter date was the one on which the Imperial Graves Commission ceased counting military fatalities as having died in the Great War. Thus, a number of men who died after 11 a.m. on the 11th of November 1918 were nonetheless officially casualties of that conflict, and of course those who had been wounded before the end date for the Western Front but died afterwards were as well. This figure also recognises that the war against Germany did not end formally until the end of June 1919, and that killing and fighting continued well beyond the 11th of November. The Anglo-Irish War, the 1919 revolt in Egypt, the Third Afghan War, and sundry other conflicts involved British and Empire troops. In fact, in very recent times, the idea of what we might call a greater Great War has gathered momentum, propounded in various slightly different forms by historians of the stature of John Horne and J. Winter. Certainly the idea of a period of international crisis and violence that predated the assassination at Sarajevo. Some trace it back to Italy's annexation of Libya from the Ottoman Empire in 1911, and which stretched well beyond the end of the fighting on the Western Front to encompass the Russian Civil War and the aftershock wars in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, which takes us arguably to 1924 and 1925. To me, this makes very good intellectual sense. The British experience needs to be located within this context, but it rarely is. Well, as responses to the Tower poppies indicate, the cost-benefit analysis of Britain in the First World War, such as it is primarily, sometimes exclusively, conducted in terms of human suffering. The number of dead, wounded, maimed in body or mind, the widows and orphans left behind. British society today is, of course, very different from that of a century ago, and not surprisingly, many of us struggle to grasp that our ancestors were prepared to undergo privation and the death of young men on a vast scale. But they thought the war and the loss of life was justified, and I think that should be the starting point for any discussion of this topic. But to get a broader picture, one also needs to examine the reasons why Britain went to war in 1914. What were their war aims? What was the threat posed to Britain by its enemies? And to what extent did the outcome of the war reflect those aims? In other words, we need to move the debate beyond the purely human and emotional to consider political and strategic issues. Well, in the past, and Nigel actually mentioned some of my publications, I have written about what we might call the futility stroke lions led by donkeys narrative of Britain's involvement in the conflict, and which I think to the present day remains the dominant popular view. The first pillar of this notion is that there were no great matters at stake during the First World War. A slightly more sophisticated version is that there were some issues, but they didn't affect Britain, and therefore Britain should and could have stayed out of the war. The short answer, the bottom line in this view is 1 million men died for nothing. The second pillar is that the lives of soldiers were routinely thrown away by criminally incompetent generals. To put it mildly, proponents of this view would answer the question of whether the losses, or to use the emotive and loaded term, sacrifices, were worth it, would be a resounding no. Well, both core arguments have been rebutted over and over again, but display remarkable longevity. This can be seen in the response of the then British government to the Centenary commemorations. The government's advisory panel was surprisingly light on professional historians, but room was found for Sebastian Faulks, the author of Birdsong, and Pat Barker, the writer of the Regeneration trilogy. Both of these novelists adhere closely to the traditional narrative. When in October 2012, the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, if you can remember him, announced the programme of official commemorations, it was noticeable that it concentrated on British defeats, such as Gallipoli and the First Day on the Somme, but completely ignored the 100 Days campaigns of 1918, when the forces of the British Empire, with their allies, won the greatest series of military victories in British history. Following pressure, the government did make a U-turn, and the Battle of Amiens, 8th of August 1918, arguably the turning point of the Western Front, was added. I was actually present at Amiens Cathedral for that commemoration. I must say it was very good indeed, but many people's attitude was this is the first they'd ever heard of this great battle, and it's a slight surprise why the government was commemorating it. Well, Cameron's 2012 speech showed little knowledge or understanding of the Great War. His statement, "To us today, it seems so inexplicable that countries which had many things binding them together could indulge in such a never-ending slaughter, but they did," inadvertently highlighted the flawed thinking behind the government's approach, and indeed many of the reactions to the First World War. It projected ill-informed 21st century attitudes back to 1914-18. And Cameron's speech reflected the popular narrative, which goes something like this. August 1914 triggered an outbreak of war enthusiasm in Britain, of which the rush to the colours to join the army was the most obvious example. But then the massive casualties and bloody battles like Gallipoli, the Somme and Passchendaele led rapidly to disillusionment, expressed in the writing of bitter war poetry and disenchanted memoirs. Well, of course, historians over many years have dismantled this crude approach. Peter Simpkins, Adrian Gregory, and especially Katrina Pennell have demonstrated that it is simply a myth that Britain was caught up in war fever from the beginning of August 1914. And this sits very well with research of scholars such as Mike Nyberg, which shows a similar situation on continental Europe. Those who were actively enthusiastic about the war at an early stage were an unrepresentative minority. In Britain, only gradually did the mass of the population come to realise the gravity of the situation, and this was reflected in the relatively slow build-up of volunteers for the army. In the first days of the war, there was a relatively small increase in army recruitment, over and above what might have been expected in peacetime, which over the course of the next 6 weeks or so escalated greatly. Voluntary recruiting actually peaked for the entire war in September 1914. Even in Ireland, a majority supported the war until the events of 1916 to 1918, specifically the Easter Rising, or probably more to the point, the British reaction to it, and the threatened introduction of conscription overturned this consensus. For a liberal democratic state to wage war, to wage total war, one aspect of which is the mass mobilisation of society, the consent of the masses is required. The fact that the British war effort was marked by a highly successful and sustained transition to a total war economy sits uneasily with notions of disillusion and a widespread popular belief that the war was futile. I suspect that Professor Sir Hugh Strawn, the sole academic military historian on the government's advisory panel, made himself rather unpopular with his colleagues when he criticised the government's line that the 1418 war should be commemorated but definitely not celebrated. There are causes for celebration too, Strawn said. It'd been pretty bad news if this war had been lost. And this view, of course, closely reflects contemporary First World War attitudes to the war while it was going on. The notion the war was pointless is intellectually bankrupt. Even if one follows the currently fashionable but minority scholarly opinion in refusing to allocate responsibility for the outbreak of war, most scholars see Germany and Austria-Hungary as primarily responsible. Once at war, Germany took full advantage. Its territorial expansion posed the gravest of threats to British security, as was recognised by the vast bulk of the British population. So then, why did the ordinary people think Britain had gone to war with Germany? At the key, I think absolutely at the centre of this is the German invasion of Belgium, which I think is the single most important incident in bringing Britain into the First World War. This was seen as being an utterly immoral act by a great power. This is the time, I think, people generally were rather more naive about the way that governments behave than possibly we are today. At the time, it was genuinely shocking on a moral basis. It was also seen as being a breach of international law. Germany, of course, like Britain, was a signatory of the 1839 treaty, which actually had guaranteed Belgian independence. And of course, it was an immense strategic threat to the UK. Going back at least to the late 16th century, it has been a fundamental tenet of English, then British foreign policy, not to let the Low Countries fall in the hands of a hostile power, particularly not a hostile power with a powerful fleet. It was, I think, a direct strategic threat to Britain. As King George V said to the American ambassador about Britain's declaration of war, "My God, Mr. Page, what choice did we have?" There, of course, was a wider threat to British security. Support of France was absolutely vital in terms of the balance of power, though at the time it was rarely explicitly said so. As someone once said, who wants to go off to be sent off to die for the balance of power? And actually, there's an interesting counterfactual. If the Germans hadn't invaded Belgium in 1914 and simply had attacked France, Britain would have been placed in a very, very difficult strategic dilemma. They couldn't afford to see France go down, but they wouldn't have had the casus belli actually to bring them into war. So Germany, not for the first time, actually did their enemies a favour by behaving in a rather ham-fisted way. There was also a direct threat to the British Empire, and I think it's well at this stage to remind ourselves, as David Edgerton has written recently, that we cannot understand Britain as the modern nation-state we have today. Britain and the Empire at this point were indissoluble as one idea of identity, by which I mean I think basically Britain and the Dominions. Britain, did not actually sort of shed ideas of empire as part of our national identity, I think, until well after 1945. I think that David Edgerton is right about that. Well, the Australians and New Zealanders, for example, were well aware of the direct threat to their integrity, rather implausibly from German colonies in the South Pacific, but actually rather more realistically, had the Royal Navy been destroyed in British home waters, that would have removed the shield behind which the Antipodean dominions sheltered. And of course, the threat was not simply from Germany, but also from a state which at the time was Britain's ally, rather to the discomfiture of the Australians and New Zealanders, that is Japan. There was a very real sense in Australia and New Zealand that Britain's war was their war in a most direct sense. Ultimately, it's all about German aggression. The Kaiser's saber rattling going back over a decade, the Anglo-German naval race launched, of course, by the Germans, the idea of aggressive militaristic Prussianism. One thing that the British were seeking to do in the First World War was to achieve an exemplary victory. That is, to give Germany such a defeat it would not resort to war for generations. Now, this actually is, I'll come back to this later on, but it's a rather less clear-cut objective than, of course, the Allied aims in the Second World War. You could argue, in fact, what is going on here is total war for limited aims. There is little doubt, if you measure Britain's war effort between 1914 and 18, it measures up really to any definition of totality, except possibly in one respect, that is the outcome of the war. Whereas from 1943 onwards, the British and Americans were demanding unconditional surrender from Nazi Germany. That is, you give up, we move in, we do whatever we like with you. And of course, what did happen in reality was that post-war Germany was remade in the image of the victors: democratic capitalist West Germany, communist Soviet East Germany. That's not what's on the cards in the First World War. Instead, in October and November 1918, when it's obvious the Germans are going to be defeated soon, there's a frantic round of discussions between politicians and senior servicemen in France and Britain. What do we want our victory to look like? Very important, of course, is the restoration of Belgian sovereignty and neutrality. That actually is basically achieved by the time the armistice comes into place. Beyond that, there's a lot of debates. The French, or at least some of the French, are very aggressive, wanting to split Germany up back into smaller states. British and Americans are rather less gung-ho. In the end, the British and the French and Americans compromise on what happens on the 11th of November. Effectively, a ceasefire in place. The Germans are allowed to retreat back to Germany itself, and then there would be a peace conference to to settle differences. Make no mistake, Germany was thoroughly defeated in November 1918, and the terms pretty well amounted to a surrender. But nonetheless, it was a surrender with the can kicked down the road to some extent about what the post-war situation would look like. So in that sense, I guess that some of the major British war aims in 1914 were fulfilled. Certainly the restoration of Belgium, the restoration of a form of balance of power, although of course that did change in the post-war period. And at the time it was thought that the blow landed on Germany was enough to prevent them from wanting to go to war at any time in the future. The analogy, of course, was with what had happened to Revolution Napoleonic France 100 years before. After 25 years of war and defeat, finally at Waterloo, the French ceased to be a major aggressive power in Europe, well, really from that point onwards. Well, some writers have portrayed Imperial Germany as a near-liberal democracy. To my mind, this is very unconvincing. Whatever the constitutional theory, real power lay in the hands of the Kaiser and his advisors. And as the war went on, civilian leaders and the Kaiser himself were pushed aside as the silent military dictatorship of Hindenburg and Ludendorff assumed power behind the scenes. Now, Imperial Germany was not like Nazi Germany, but it was bad enough. From July to November 1918, Allied forces fought a campaign that freed occupied territory, and the troops were greeted ecstatically by French and Belgian civilians who had endured more than 4 years of harsh occupation, which included deportations and forced labour. And we mustn't forget that the deliberate policy of execution of Belgian and French civilians that was carried out by German forces in the beginning of the war in August, September 1914. The fact that Britain in 1918, not normally seen in this context at all, was fighting a war of liberation, just as much a war of liberation as British forces were to fight in 1944-45, I think is an important fact which needs to be placed in the balance when we decide whether the war was worth it or not. Most wars, of course, end with a negotiated peace long before there's a peace of exhaustion or the comprehensive defeat of one side or the other. And the First World War basically straddles those two categories. This did not happen in 1418, in large part because Germany, having conquered substantial tracts of territory early on, refused to give them up. Understandably, France was determined to fight on till the enemy was expelled from its soil. Therefore, there was simply no grounds for compromise. Neither was there much pressure from below for a compromised peace, not in Britain anyway. There were exaggerated tales of enemy atrocities, but genuine German behaviour stoked hatred and fear of a ruthless enemy. The German Navy shelled English coastal towns, Zeppelins dropped bombs on London. The list went on and on. Support for a war can be expressed in many ways, and the reaction of the bulk of the British public can be described not as sort of patriotic flag waving, but rather as grim determination to see the war through to the end. In 1914, the UK was a democracy, albeit an incomplete one, governed on liberal principles. And the masses, I think, actively supported a total war that encompassed the whole of society. As I've already mentioned, without that buy-in, waging such a conflict would have been impossible. As dreadful as the war was, a German victory was regarded as even worse. But were the bulk of the people deluded, victims of propaganda, of false consciousness? Well, most British people believed they had a stake in their home country. Junior clerks and professional men like solicitors and doctors were many rungs apart on the ladder of prosperity, but both feared that their world would be shattered if Britain was defeated by Germany. But Britain was an overwhelmingly working-class country, arguably the most proletarian country in the world. And the army, of course, like 80% drawn from the working class. While many lived in poverty, there was a feeling that this was still better than the conditions that their parents and grandparents had lived in. And they were right. Many things had improved the lives of those at the bottoms of society in the years before the First World War. The introduction of old age pensions was an obvious example, but more generally, there was a rise in living standards, and trade union activity had helped to improve conditions in various industries. And it must be said, this is often forgotten, even after the First World War, this period, this pattern of reform benefiting the poorest in society actually to a large extent continued. Even the poorest during the First World War felt they had something to lose from a German victory, that this relative prosperity would be snatched away. Soldiers saw with their own eyes the destructions of villages on the Western Front, while civilians heard the pitiful tales of the 250,000 Belgian refugees in Britain, by far the largest movement of refugees to the British Isles in history. And this was enough to convince most people that the war was worth fighting. They didn't want to see similar things happen at home. And all of this led to a remarkable staying power in both the army and the nation. Perhaps the most striking example is that the punitive terms imposed on the Bolshevik regime by the Germans at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918 left little doubt as to the fate of Britain should it be defeated. This is the way that Germany treated defeated enemies. And this was an important factor in stiffening British morale, civilian and military, in the face of the great German Spring Offensive, which coincidentally opened just a matter of weeks later. Well, some writers, such as the late Alan Clark, bemoan the fact that Britain entered the war in 1914, seeing as an important step in the diminution of British power. While more recently, Neil Ferguson famously argued that a quick German victory in 1914 would have been for the best. A benign Kaiser's European Union would have emerged. Well, let me just say that I and many other historians find this argument deeply unconvincing. Imperfect as undoubtedly the world was in 1919, a world in which Germany was victorious would have been much worse. France would have been reduced to a vassal state. Belgium would have become a de facto German colony. Liberal democracy would have been largely extinguished in Europe. Now, if the Royal Navy had been intact, Britain would have been safe from invasion, but instead faced with the nightmare of a continental Europe united under a hostile and aggressive power that now possessed key naval bases that menaced the UK security. This actually was the absolute doomsday scenario for the Foreign Office, for example, in 1918, when it did look like the Allies were going to be defeated. The British, in other words, had no illusions about the gravity of the threat. Allied victory in 1918 averted this threat for the moment. The Allies were incapable of destroying Germany in 1918, even if they had been willing to do so. The war was won, but the peace was subsequently lost. It would take a second and even more destructive war finally to do away with the German threat. So for all these reasons, I must conclude reluctantly, from the UK's perspective, the outcome of the war against Germany in 1918 was worth the sacrifice, and it was recognised as such. Disillusionment with the war is largely a post-war phenomenon. Soldiers came back to a place which was not a land fit for heroes. There was considerable economic distress, and there was adjustment to the new reality of the messy post-war world and reduced British power. But again, I think recent scholarship has demonstrated that Britain actually was rather stronger through to 1939 than traditionally has been thought. Well, in assessing whether for Britain the results of the First World War justify the expenditure of blood and treasure, as I already said, I would differentiate between the war with Germany, essentially a defensive war against aggression, and the parallel imperial campaigns, especially the war against the Ottoman Empire. Britain certainly went to war in 1914 in part to protect its empire, but it did not go to war in order to expand it. But in the course of events, it later acquired colonies from Germany and Ottoman Turkey. There were strategic reasons to do so, some better than others, but it was also the knee-jerk reaction of an imperial power. One might suggest that's the way that empires behave. And it must be said that the war against the Ottomans greatly inflated the British Empire's casualty list without, I think, doing very much to shorten the war against Germany. From the perspective of the First World War, of course, we have to bear in mind that British decision makers were thinking imperially. And to come with a sort of judgment from today, I mean, something like Mesopotamia, for example, I suspect that you could justify the initial campaign, which was to land at the head of the Persian Gulf in order to secure Basra and oil and so on and so forth. It's much more difficult to justify the subsequent advance inland, which ended up after a lot of problems, including a major defeat of the British Army and heavy casualties of the conquest of Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. So on both strategic and moral grounds, I actually have rather more qualms about whether the war against the Ottoman Empire was worth it. Well, okay, for the final part of my talk, I'm going to have a case study of the way in which the centenary of the Battle of the Somme in 2016 was handled by the government. How much of what I've been talking about was actually reflected during the centenary years? Or put another way, what attempt was made to educate the public about one of the central facts of Britain's war, that there was a high level of public support for the war effort, or to put it more crudely, most people at the time thought the high cost of the war was worth paying. Well, to quote my Wolverhampton colleague, Professor Stephen Badsey, just as television executives generally refuse to commission historical documentaries that portray controversies or unusual ideas, except perhaps as a heavily flagged personal view, the government took a similar approach to the commemoration of the First World War. It chose to follow public opinion rather than take a lead, perhaps scared of antagonizing voters by challenging what are in some cases deeply held views about the supposed futility of the 1418 war. Well, the centenary of the Somme would have appeared to have offered a significant opportunity for the UK government to put forward a balanced perspective. This campaign is popularly believed to represent the nadir of the British Army in the First World War. At any rate, the first day of it is, personal experience has shown me that most lay people have only the haziest idea of what went on after the 1st of July, or indeed actually went on that day, and many are surprised to find out the battle lasted right the way through until November. At some point in the 1960s, the Somme superseded the Third Battle of Ypres, Passchendaele, in the collective memory of the British as the benchmark of Western Front meaningless horror. Scholarly work, however, has cast the Somme in a different light. The Somme was fought at a time and a place dictated by Britain's French allies, in great part for reasons of coalition solidarity. Though bloodily and in some ways inefficiently conducted by the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, the Somme had sound strategic aims. In the event, the most ambitious aim of reopening mobile warfare did not come to pass, but German pressure on the French army at Verdun was relieved, the attrition inflicted on the Germans was significant, and German high command, keen to avoid a new Somme, determined on a new strategy, unrestricted submarine warfare against merchant shipping, which of course proved disastrous because it brought the then neutral United States into the war without knocking the British out of it. And as a byproduct of the Somme fighting, the large but poorly trained British Empire Citizen Army gained valuable experience and was a much more formidable force in 1917, 1918. So far from being a futile bloodbath, the Somme had vital military and strategic consequences. It was a strategic success for the Entente, a vital step on the path to eventual victory. And the Somme did not cause public support for the war to slacken. Rather ironically, because he was an opponent of these sorts of large-scale attritional battles, David Lloyd George came to power at the end of 1916, in part, I think, because of the Somme, as a total warrior, replacing the regarded as somewhat ineffectual H.H. Asquith as Prime Minister, and certainly Britain went into 1917 as committed to fight the war as ever. Now, little, if any, of this important context was reflected in the UK government's approach to commemorating the centenary of the battle. Now, it's fair to say not all historians would agree with the interpretation I've just given. Nonetheless, the arguments in favour of this are powerful, too powerful, one would have thought, simply to have been ignored. That's effectively what the government chose to do. The spurious argument was that it was not up to the government to interpret history, but this falls down because if it suits them, governments do just that. The commemorations of the 50th anniversaries of D-Day and VE Day in 1994 and 95 were respectively both commemorated as great victories, with more than a hint of triumphalism, and more recently, Margaret Thatcher's death and near-state funeral in 2013 were marked by a clear official narrative that effectively excluded criticism of this most controversial of post-war prime ministers. By focusing on loss and sacrifice, without admitting there were other aspects of the Somme worthy of commemoration, the government put forward a conservative, small c, and in scholarly terms, extremely outdated interpretation. The failure even to place the Somme into the context of an attritional war fought by a coalition was particularly striking. The government's stance on the Somme can be gauged from public statements made by John Whittingdale MP, the then Secretary of State at the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. And the DCMS's press release about the commemorative event to be held in Manchester on the 1st July 2016, the centenary of the first day of the Battle of the Somme, included this statement from Whittingdale. The Battle of the Somme resulted in 1 million casualties on the Western Front and touched the lives of millions of families at home. It's important that we provide as many ways as we can for the public to commemorate the bravery and sacrifices of our ancestors 100 years ago. Well, if not actively misleading, this statement is certainly capable of being misinterpreted. The figure of 1 million is arrived at by totalling British Empire, French and German casualties, but the context of Whittingdale's statement and the references to home implies there were 1 million British casualties on the Somme in 1916. The figure is actually around 420,000, which is dreadful enough. What is more, lay people are apt to understand casualties as meaning fatalities, and of course it means killed, wounded, missing and prisoners. In other words, what Whittingdale appears to be saying is that 1 million British soldiers died on the Somme. His statement is also interesting for what it did not say. He mentioned bravery and sacrifice. It did not mention what Allied armies achieved on the Somme in the short term, or indeed in the long term, the road to victory perspective, let alone the fact the Somme was part of a total war against a hated and feared enemy, a conflict which enjoyed high levels of support from the population of Britain. Although he did not use the words, the impression he gave was of futility, of meaningless slaughter. He gave no context and ignored the strategic consequences of the battle. By omission, Whittingdale gave the impression that British soldiers on the Somme had died in vain. Perhaps you could make too much of a single ministerial soundbite, but this is what the government chose to put on its website. Moreover, the sentiments expressed are consistent with Whittingdale's pronouncements to Battle of the Somme over the previous year. He example, called the Somme obviously the most significant, quote, commemorative event of the Great War Centenary. Well, the privileging of this particular event over others in the British experience of the Great War is problematic from the point of view of the historian. Was it really more significant than Jutland or the great battles of 1918 that brought about Allied victory on the Western Front? But it did accurately reflect the public view of the Somme. Another of his statements, we must never forget the scale of what happened on the Somme. More died on the first day of battle than any other day of the First World War, contrived to mix factual inaccuracy. For example, 27,000 French soldiers were killed on the 22nd of August 1914, 19,500 on the first day of the Somme for the Brits, with its emphasis on casualties to the exclusion of everything else and relentless Britannicentrism. The one area where the Somme's government narrative, other way around, the Somme's government narrative departed from the traditional approach was in avoiding blaming Haig and other generals. Presumably it was felt that it was inappropriate for the UK government to overtly criticise British military commanders, even those of a century ago. Recent perceived military failures in Iraq and Afghanistan has promoted something of a new Lions led by donkeys narrative of political dangers in stressing high-level military ineptitude, which in any case flies in the face of much recent scholarship on the Western Front generalship. To conclude, the Centenary of the Somme offered an opportunity for the UK government to, at the very least, promote a debate by recognising there was more to it than simply bravery and sacrifice, as important as they were. There was a chance to discuss the relationship between the armed forces, the state and society in 1916, and how it differs today, and why men volunteered in their hundreds of thousands, why the mass citizen army and the society that produced and supported it believed that war was worth fighting, even after the telegrams informing families their loved ones had been killed were arriving at houses big and small across the land. An imaginative conversation about the nature of national identity, what it meant to be British in 1916 and what it meant to be British in 2016 would have been fitted extremely well with the Somme commemorations. Sadly, none of this came to pass. Instead, there were ceremonies which were variant on Remembrance Sunday and an arts event featuring music and interpretive dance. In short, the UK let slip a golden opportunity to challenge popular perceptions of the First World War. The vast majority of the British Empire soldiers who fought on the Somme in 1916 and the populations from which they were drawn believed they were fighting a just and essential war. They thought the war was worth it. It is shameful that the lineal successor of the government that sent the men to fight on the Somme was unwilling publicly to recognise the depth of public support and the real reasons why they were fighting. Instead, by omitting to provide context or to engage with the historical debates, the UK government gave the impression that the British soldiers of the First World War fought and died in vain. Thank you very much.